The Winnipeg Jets lineup this year is going to look markedly different than years past. A lot of veterans are out. We've got some new rookies. Let's try and figure out how the Jets might line up for this upcoming 2024-25 season.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Good evening, friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, we just love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and be sure to use promo code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Download Gametime today. What time is it? Gametime. Now, before we start off tonight's episode, I just want to get this out of the way. The reason that I'm not going to talk about the Gaudreau, the tragic passing of Johnny and Matthew Gaudreau on this particular episode is because it didn't feel right for me to talk about it with how the show is currently structured and how we usually do episodes. So there is going to be a separate one-off, not a full episode, but I was thinking of trying to think of the right things to say, and it putting it in our usual show format with our usual ad reads and stuff, it didn't feel right. It didn't feel respectful. And I wanted to do their memory justice as much as I could to try and honor their memory. So we'll have a separate little upload about that and some thoughts as much as I can collect them on the tragic loss. But for this episode, I did want to talk a little bit about the upcoming Winnipeg Jets season, putting it in our usual show format. And if you want to hear some of my thoughts about the tragic passing this past week, there will be a separate video. But for this show, I wanted to spend some time talking about the upcoming Jets season, just because it is getting closer and closer. I know it certainly doesn't feel like it's just a few weeks away. But, somehow the Jets have a game, to start the season in just what really amounts to like 6 or 7 weeks. And wow, if there's ever been a season where I don't really know what the Jets lineup is going to be like, I have to say it's probably this one. With Botus, I usually had at least some indication of where his mind was at. I think Rick is, relatively old school in a lot of ways. And so it's not like I'd say he was predictable, but I don't think he truly went against the grain of a lot of what the Jets had been running previously. His approach was generally not that dissimilar with some of the line combinations to what we saw with Maurice. And so in that respect, it was relatively straightforward. It was a little more predictable. And that's where I think Arniel is likely to shake things up. Scott, I think, has a different perspective on what he wants out of his team. I think that he has already sort of hinted at the fact that things are not going to be status quo and that he's going to arrange his lineups a little bit differently. And, he's already sort of hinted at what changes he might be looking at first. And I think one of the big ones, of course, has been sort of the first line. He was not committal, or was non-committal about how that unit's going to look, which I think is probably a good sign that he's not interested in keeping Connor and Scheifele together. But obviously the question is, well, assuming that the Jets roster stays roughly the same as it is right now in this very moment, what is his likely line combo? And I think it's going to be Ehlers, Scheifele, and Velarde. When he was interim, coach for a couple of months, that trio worked really well. I think he probably wanted to continue with it. Maybe there was some internal pushback from Scheifele, but I think given what we've seen with Arniel, that's likely to be his go-to unit. Now, the second line is where I think I start to have some questions. My sense and thought is that you have Connor, Nemesnikov, and Perfetti together. I think in limited sample sizes, Connor and Perfetti played well together. Obviously, we don't have a lot of data to lean on there, but if Arniel's kind of, hedging his bets and looking at some of the early returns from when they were briefly paired together last year, he might imagine that this is a better way to handle it than putting Connor and Scheifele together. I think that much is fairly obvious. We have a much bigger sample size of Connor and Scheifele not really working super well together. So if you get away from that duo, I think it opens up a lot more opportunities, but then it also makes the questions around the lineup that much bigger. Then that makes you ask, okay, so given that we're not even really getting into any of the rookies in the top six, where do Chibrikov and Lambert fill in? Right now, I kind of feel like we're going to see something in effect of like Niederreiter, Lowry, and Lambert as your third line. I think that trio could be really interesting. The one thing that Lowry does super well is gain offensive zone time. Like he's in that area, he's between the faceoff circles, he'll grind along the walls behind the net. He does everything. And I think one thing that he's actually not really appreciated enough for is his passing. He does pull off some very nice feeds, even if his own personal goal scoring output hasn't exactly been consistent over the years. I mean, everyone sort of jokes that Lowry has stone hands. I think finishing wise, that's probably not the most unfair assessment. I mean, he's spotted, 10, 15 goals in some years and even had a decent season a year or two ago, one of his career goal scoring years. But generally speaking, you sort of know what you're getting with him. A forechecker, a leader on the ice, and somebody who's maybe going to be more of the space creator than the direct goal threat. But that's where Niederreiter and Lambert might be able to help with that. Brad is such a dynamic skater, and I think we're going to see that this year. It also kind of eases Brad into the NHL with a guy down the middle who's super defensively responsible and can maybe teach Lambert some of the keys to manning that position so that, as Lambert acclimates to the NHL level, he can start to think about his long-term future as maybe Winnipeg's 2C if it all pans out and everything goes the way that we're sort of hoping it does. Now, the fourth line is where you're going to see a lot of battles, I would imagine, for spots. I still think that there may be a move or two to free up some space down there and some cap space. I just feel like the Jets are a little overcrowded with depth forwards, and some of them are a little bit on the more expensive side. So for the fourth line, I would imagine it's something to the order of Barron, maybe like an Iafallo or a Gustafsson, and then probably Chibrikov or maybe Appleton. I mean, Appleton, I feel like, has the inside track just because he's the veteran and he also PKs and stuff. But like if Arniel's really serious about looking for improvements and things, I don't really know how you justify not potentially using Chibrikov. And that's why I kind of think the Jets may have to look at perhaps cutting a contract or two. Appleton's a good player. He is, zero question. But he could also bring you a likely good trade return. And the Jets just have a lot of players in similar roles who could probably do something in a similar manner to what Appleton has done the past couple of years. And that's not to say that he hasn't brought enough value. He's actually brought more than I think he's getting paid for. But with that in mind, I think, with his contract coming up, like an extension that's likely needed and the sort of price tag that's likely to accompany it, along with the fact that you've got youth pushing for roles right now in spots where Appleton would be likely to play. I just feel like that could be an efficiency the Jets take advantage of, especially if they're looking for some defensive help or maybe some futures. So, that all kind of feeds into perhaps the next big question is what surprises might be in store for the upcoming camps and preseasons. Are we likely to see some big shakeups? We'll chat about that in just a quick moment. But before we go too much further, I did want to shout out our friends and partners at FanDuel. You've heard us talk a lot about FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Obviously, it's a safe and secure app. Lots of folks already use FanDuel already. It's great for tracking all of your favorite sports, whether you're into football, both professional and collegiate, baseball. They've got automotive racing, of course, hockey. There's plenty of props, bets, and odds for Winnipeg Jets games, players, and season outcomes and performances. So whatever you're into, FanDuel has your back. But we've got something a little bit different for you. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. With a YouTube-based TV plan, you'll also be able to watch every regular season Sunday afternoon out-of-market game. For those of you who maybe live in Winnipeg and you're looking for some big Vikes action, this is probably the best way for you to do so. All you need is a Google account and a current form of payment, and you can cancel anytime. That's 3 free weeks of NFL Sunday Ticket, all with a $5 bet at FanDuel. Just visit FanDuel.com to download America's #1 sportsbook. Hey friends, and welcome back to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we're just chatting about, some predictions for the upcoming Jets lineups and season. And you notice I did just sort of chat about pretty much the forward lines more than anything. Didn't get to the defense because for me, I kind of wonder if that's where we start to see the first of some of the big surprises that could be in store as Arniel starts to really showcase his vision for what he wants the Winnipeg Jets to be going forward. Before we really dive into what I could potentially see happening during camp and preseason, just wanted to say thanks again for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day, every day. For your second listen, please enjoy and check out the Locked On NHL podcast. Locked On NHL provides you with a national perspective on all things NHL each and every day with national experts and local insight on every team in the league. It's available on YouTube or wherever you get your favorite podcasts. All part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Now, I think for the camp this year and for preseason and, really the start of the regular season, one of the biggest surprises I'm kind of wondering about is if we start to see Neil Pionk get a reduced role. I think it's a hard sell for a lot of reasons to the coaching staff. For one thing, I think the org absolutely loves Neil Pionk. There is zero question in my mind that as a player and as really an ambassador for the team and somebody that they have continually relied upon, they just love the guy. And I may not be as fond of his on-ice performance as the Jets are, but I understand it, right? He's a guy who constantly fights hard. He gives his all every shift, and there's never really been a question about his effort, right? Really, it's more in just the outcomes. Pionk has struggled the past couple of seasons. Ever since we had that bubble year, he's, kind of looked more and more like the New York Rangers version of himself, and I don't think him kind of getting older has necessarily helped that. So, in a lot of ways, you can kind of sort of see the writing on the wall in terms of the direction that his aging curve is moving. But the Jets haven't always matched that particular trend, right? They love to play him as a top four. They've relied upon him heavily in all situations. And I just don't think that that's the player he is anymore. Maybe a few years ago, it wouldn't have been as big of a deal, but I think increasingly past couple of seasons, we've really seen him start to decline rapidly. And it's a shame because, again, when it comes to guys who I've always said are really likable and players that I'm personally fond of, even though they do struggle on the ice, I think Pionk has been one of those guys who it's really tough for me. I love the person that he is. He seems like such a hardworking, nice guy. Not to say that any of the other Jets aren't. I'm sure everyone busts their butt on this team, right? There's no question about that. Everyone fights for the badge. Everyone really loves to represent this team for the most part. And so I can't imagine that anyone's really taking shifts off. But Pionk, I just feel always gave a little bit extra. So it's kind of tough when it seems like he's out there struggling. But I kind of wonder if Arniel's looking at the underlyings and maybe thinking about changing his role. If Arniel maybe puts him on the third pairing or at least uses him a bit less than previous seasons, I think that could be a really big change for the Jets, and I think it would help out not only Pionk's game, but also the rest of the defense. Neil not having to take on as much responsibility while maybe Heinola takes on some of that burden, and maybe Sandberg gets more of it. Maybe Colin Miller takes more of it. I think that there's ways that you can sort of dial down the deployments for him without, humiliating him, right? anytime you get a demotion, like, let's be real, guys are going to take it personally. They're going to take it hard. And I don't think you want to like really further plummet his confidence any more than it already is. I know that he's been frustrated over the past couple of seasons because I think he can kind of tell that his own performance hasn't been up to snuff. There was that one year I always come back to that he said his game was embarrassing. So if there's anyone who knows that he is having a tough time out there, it's Neil Pionk. And so I don't want to like crater his confidence or anything. But I do think it's probably time to revisit that top 4 role. If you kind of maybe get the third pairing more closer to what the second pairing is playing, it might help to ease some of that burden, or at least, swap out some shifts here and there, maybe try some different pairing combos and have Neil get an extra rest or two so that when he is ready to bring 100%, he can give 110% because he's already doing 100% on almost every shift. Now you can maybe give him a little bit of time off and perhaps you'll be able to see better returns out of the minutes that he does play. But I think for moving the puck a little bit more efficiently, for making some cleaner zone exits, I think that sort of thing could be helpful. I think another big surprise could be that Lambert maybe earns a bigger role out of camp and preseason than we're currently projecting. I know I just talked about him on the third line, and I really do think that is one of the safer starting places, but maybe he hits it off so well in preseason that the Jets are like, well, let's put him up top somewhere in the top 6 and see if he can sink or swim. I'm not averse to that within reason. I don't know if I would necessarily want to put him on the second line center role immediately. You can try that. I don't think it's going to last super long. I think he might have some issues, especially with the processing speed and the decision-making required to play that role. I think sometimes people maybe underestimate how hard it is to be the 2C. And people will look at Nemesnikov and they're like, well, he's not a 2C either. And I think on a true contender, probably not, right? You're looking at more like a bottom 6 player. But Vlad has shown that, generally speaking, he's capable of keeping up. And he's got the veteran experience that I think Lambert maybe doesn't yet have. Vlad's been around this league a long time. He's been with some cup winners. He knows how it goes in this industry. He knows the timing and stuff. And I think that's a level of experience that Lambert just won't be able to surpass initially. So I think, going forward, I think we're going to see Lambert maybe sit in the bottom 6. I think that's the most likely starting place. But again, if he hits it out of the park during preseason and he looks like he's comfortable at a level that clearly indicates a third line role is just not good enough, then I'm certainly open to having him try a spot, probably as a winger first, out wide up top. Again, I don't think that's as likely as it is for him to start somewhere on the third or fourth line. That's just my gut instinct. And I think Arniel also has to be, conscientious of balancing veteran status versus rookies, not because he thinks the rookies are naturally going to perform less impressively than the veterans, but because sometimes you have to do things from the perspective of managing locker room egos and reputations and personalities. And it is tough, right? You're kind of doing some HR work in managing those relationships, and you don't want to alienate guys or make them feel angry and have them perhaps even take it out on some of the rookies, right? You don't want to create toxic relationships immediately, especially with the team that's, quite frankly, just haven't come out of some really toxic situations to begin with. So I think I would say that of the people on this team that probably are keenly aware of that, Arniel has to be at or near the top because he saw what happened with the Jets previously, and I'm sure he's not really eager to repeat some of those same follies. But if there are any other surprises, I think I would anticipate it's probably seeing which depth forwards get benched. I really do think that Chibrikov adds enough offensive punch that guys like Appleton just maybe haven't been able to quite eclipse that level of finishing talent. And that's funny to say about Appleton because he actually did score quite a few goals in the previous couple of seasons, or at least scored, a good 30 points. But at the end of the day, you're trying to find those inefficiencies and how to add a little bit more offensive punch. what skill can you improve upon to get that extra bit of offensive output? And I think that's where a guy like Chibrikov or Lambert really can make the difference for the middle and bottom six, which naturally means that some of the guys who are currently there might not have as secure an NHL role. And Appleton not being in the initial starting lineup would be, I would say, one of the biggest surprises, because he's been a steadfast servant to the team for years. He's a guy who I think a lot of coaches would kill to have. He's tough on his skates. He's a guy who forechecks and defends reasonably well. He's got solid shooting ability and pretty good passing. And he's such a jack of all trades that I'm sure most teams would kill to have an Appleton somewhere in the rotation. But the Jets have to find even more offensive talent in the bottom six, because the top six just doesn't have the elite, crazy franchise level game breaking talent that teams like Colorado and some of those like insane contenders do, right? There's extracting more value further down the lineup, because the top of the lineup is perhaps delivering a bit less than what some of the absolute best teams are getting from their top stars. And I think that's probably how I've tried to frame it. So, if a guy like Appleton or Iafallo gets benched, I wouldn't be shocked. Now, there is one perhaps bigger question that kind of ties into this big surprise thing, and it's sort of about Lowry's role this upcoming season, right? How do the Jets want to use him? Because in previous years, he's been like an every down sort of player, getting as much as fringe second line minutes in some games, partly because he plays, on the PK and stuff, and partly because coaches just seem to love him. Where does he sort of fit on that scale this year? I think it's a harder question for the Jets to answer, and one that I'm curious to investigate here in just a quick moment. But before we go too much further, I did want to shout out our friends and partners at Gametime. For those of you who have ever bought tickets, whether it's to sporting events or concerts, whatever it is, it's a huge pain in the butt. You get hit with surprise fees. You often end up paying a lot more than you're expecting. And sometimes you are buying blindly, which can be really frustrating, right? You're buying a ticket to a seat that you hope has a good view, but you have to have faith that you're not suddenly being obstructed, or you have a really crappy viewing angle. Trust me, I've been there. I've been at some venues that don't have naturally good sight lines to the stage, and when you're sitting trying to crane your neck around somebody else's shoulders or hair, it's not the most fun experience, let alone you having the misfortune of sitting behind a big piece of concrete or architecture that really blocks your view. Gametime totally gets the same struggles. They've themselves had it probably at some point in their lives, and that's why they've helped to create an awesome app that allows you to save time, money, and stress buying tickets. Gametime is here to help with so many awesome features. They've just introduced a new one called Gametime Picks that makes getting tickets for your favorite live events even easier. Gametime Picks filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. Gametime offers you last-minute tickets, lowest prices, all-in pricing, which you can actually select as an option to display all of the fees all up front, so you're not getting hit with surprise charges. And of course, they'll offer you a panoramic view from your seat in the app before you buy your tickets. And if you somehow find a lower price somewhere else, Gametime will credit you 110% of the difference. This is why I highly recommend Gametime. I think it's a great app. I've certainly looked through their deals for some Ravens tickets and even made a purchase for a playoff ticket a while back. Highly recommend it. It's awesome. And for those of you who are first-time users and create an account, be sure to use promo code LOCKEDONNHL to get yourself a cheeky $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. What time is it? It's game time. Hey friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we are just wrapping up with some thoughts on changing roles, big surprises, and what I personally am wondering about with respect to, Adam Lowry this upcoming season. I sort of wonder if it's time for him to maybe get a bit of a reduced role, not because he's been bad for the Jets. Quite the opposite. He's actually so freaking good at creating space and attacking, the net front area that his biggest problem, if you can even call it that, is that he just doesn't finish enough on the zone time that he creates. So it's great at setting up the other lines, but I think the thing that I wished we had a little bit more of with Adam, and it's something I mentioned with earlier, it's just the finishing, right? He certainly helps set up goals, and he's on the ice for a lot of good stuff, but it just doesn't turn into scoring enough. And the reason that I have to say it's kind of a problem for the Jets is because what I mentioned earlier with Winnipeg's top six, they don't have players in the first and second lines that individually take over shifts and score you goals. They don't really have that kind of assemblage of talent. What they do have are lines that tend to be better than the sum of their parts. And I think Ehlers, Scheifele, and Velarde are a great example of that. Now, the thing with those parts is that they're still really, really, really good. In some cases, elite, but maybe not at the level of like a McDavid or a McKinnon, right? People aren't really talking about any of those guys in that same talent tier. But together, they play beautiful hockey. But when they aren't scoring, and maybe if the second line isn't scoring, you need to get more offense then out of your bottom six. And that's where having Lowry play so much might be a bit of a challenge, right? I think you have to ask yourself, are you getting enough goals out of that line? If you're making a third secondary scoring line that at times actually plays more than your second line, then you'd better be darn sure they're actually making the most of it. And sometimes I feel that line hasn't been able to do that. It's why I've kind of maintained the Jets need to add either more finishing talent to that line, or the lines that have been finishing their opportunities, like the fourth line, to be honest, might be worth giving them more of the offensive zone time and maybe even a few extra deployments over their regular 5v5 shifts. So with Lowry, I kind of wonder if this is maybe the year that you move him more towards like a secondary third line role. I'm saying more than fourth line, but perhaps not as much as he's played in previous seasons. And you might look at his ice time and think it's not as bad as it seems, but in some of these games, he's been playing more than Nick Ehlers. And I get it, PK and all that, but like by the same token, still a lot of extra ice time at 5v5 that he also received on top of the PK time, which naturally meant that guys like Ehlers and some others have kind of not played as much. And I think that's not great for a Jets offense that at times has struggled to create and score offense. Again, it kind of comes back to what Arniel has maintained throughout the entire offseason. The Jets need to get 5 to 10% better and reallocating ice time where, sure, they may win those shifts, but they're not scoring on it. Well, you kind of need to get goals. I mean, that's the only way that you're going to get through. It's the only way that you're going to win in the postseason. And if you ain't scoring, you ain't winning. So long story short, it might be time to reevaluate whether Lowry's playing just a few too many shifts for the upcoming season, where we're going to need to get some more offensive punch from players that maybe are going to be sitting a little further into the depth chart than some of the the existing veterans. But let me know what your thoughts are on this. Do you think that Lowry is playing just enough? Would you prefer he play less? Drop your thoughts in comments below or at my social medias at @LivingLoco and at @LO_Winnipeg Jets. For tonight's episode, though, that is going to be all the time that we have. I thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day, every day. We will see you back here at the start of September. Obviously, it's going to be, just a few weeks now until the preseason kicks in. September 16th, I believe, is our pivot point for full regular 5-day-a-week coverage. So get excited for that. But for tonight's episode, that is going to be all the time that we have. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day, every day. We'll see you later in September. So thanks for listening. Have a great night. And as always, go Jets go.